I guess this is the end of this German day, and we are taking a very specific angle to this. If you first take a short look at this map, so familiar to many of you, you see on the top of the map a few countries who we usually call the Scandinavian countries. If we are to be semantically correct, it is only Denmark, Norway, and Sweden that are Scandinavia in the real sense, but we usually speak about the Nordic countries or the Scandinavian countries, including also Finland and Iceland. We have one problem which may have to do, let's say, with the self-confidence of the Nordic countries. Some people might feel that they are a little bit too much boasting about their role in the world. Here is the explanation. You may have heard about the Mercator projection syndrome. Well, this is anyway, it was a scientist some hundreds of years ago who had the idea how to make a round thing flat. And you know, the globe happens to be round. And if you make that flat, you can't do that without doing some compromises as far as the size of the countries are concerned. So this is why on every world map or European map you see, you will have an let's say, an abnormally big Scandinavia. The Scandinavian countries are not that big as they look at this map. In real life. They are, Norway and Sweden are quite long countries, yes, but no, they are not that big because here, in comparison, Germany and France and so on look rather tiny, which they are not really. And this is the very simple geoscientific explanation to this phenomena. And sometimes I feel, I've served for so many years as a Swedish diplomat, also as a Nordic diplomat in the United Nations, when you previously you very often made speeches on behalf of the Nordic countries, which was a great honor and great fun. But we always then had a feeling that we were a little bit better. Why could we say so? I'm speaking about the 70s and 80s and so on. Well, because we had an excellent growth. You have just heard two excellent speeches about Germany's growth and Germany's development, so on. They started from a complete destruction. Denmark or Norway started from a rather bad situation, having been occupied by the Germans. Finland had two wars with the Soviet Union, and Sweden had somehow avoided the war. But anyway, there was booming industry and development and social welfare in the Nordic countries through the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and more or less still going on. So there was always a feeling among Swedish and Norwegian or Danish, particularly these three countries, that, we are morally almost superior. Nobody would say that, and I'm saying this now in a very as an old cynical man who has served the DIP, so I can allow myself for these kind of statements. But be aware of that when you speak to some Swede, Norwegian, or Dane who says, "Well, we know this better than you." The opposite in these things are the Germans, as a matter of fact, because they had this terrible story, so they had to somehow ask to apologize the whole world for decades after the Second World War. With right, there was a lot to apologize, because they did the Nazis committed terrible crimes. So, but this went on into the second and third generation, and you will still see that the Germans are not waving their flags very much, except when they are Weltmeister, which fortunately they now are with this beautiful team, which we all love, don't we? Now, the North European aspect, or let's say approach to European matters, is to some extent similar to the traditional Nordic approach, and the North Europeans, including Germany, including to some extent Belgium, Netherlands, but definitely including the Nordic countries, has been criticized by Southern Europeans, particularly from 2008 on in the Euro crisis, where they say, you are trying to tell us how we should run our business. And the crisis, of course, is well known to everybody, approaching 30, 40, 50% unemployment in the Southern European countries. And then the demonstrations in the street are very much anti-Merkel and anti the Germans. Somehow the Swedes and the Danes escape that because we are not in the euro. The Finns escape it simply because they probably forget that the Finns might also have the same opinion as the Germans have. So there is some people quite seriously are speaking about the new European wall. As a European with a strong vision of a federal Europe, I hate the idea. And I think it is a very sad prospect if somehow Europe should be split into a northern part and into a southern part. But as many people, politicians and media and others say, here in this part, let's say north of the Alps, not quite sure where France ends up here, if it is partly north of the Alps or partly south of it. Ask the politicians. But anyway, they tend to say, here we have good finances, budget in balance, or at least on the way to become balanced. We have loyal taxpayers. People pay their tax. We just heard from the German colleague that the record was beaten in Germany in tax income. And you have these kind of records in the Scandinavian countries all the time because people, they don't love to pay tax, but they do pay the tax. And they don't evade that much. Of course, some people try to put their money in Switzerland and so on, but most people pay their tax, and that's a kind of virtue which the Northern Europeans are very proud of. The politicians are comparatively respected. If you go out in the street, you won't hear, like you hear in Italy, I politici sono ladri. The politicians are scoundrels, or they are criminal, or whatever. That's almost a tradition. In Greece, in Italy, to some extent in Spain as well, you don't hear that here. You say that politician is a bad guy, or that politician, but on the other hand, I like that one. So they are comparatively respected. And there is a relatively solid political landscape in Northern Europe, which means the parties are there. They are not such an enormous chaotic turmoil or new parties or parties going out and so on. You have a certain stability in this democracy. And of course, there is a priority for education and culture. I should add science, of course. Education, culture, and science are given priority in this part of the world, which of course for the future is something very promising. Now, on top of this, on the international stage, you will see an openness towards international responsibility. You will notice that, oh, that was confirmed. So the Nordic countries always took a very strong responsibility in UN affairs. We had the first UN Secretary General was Norwegian, Trygve Lie. The second one was Swedish, Dag Hammarskjöld, and so on. There is a tradition of eminent Nordic politicians in the United Nations system, which reflects a commitment to the UN system. And you will find the reflection of this commitment also in terms of financing. So you will find the Nordic countries as the big financiers of the United Nations Development Program, UNHCR, UNICEF, etc. So there is this responsibility, and there is also the solidarity. On the top of the League of International Development Assistance, you will find the Nordic countries. And also on the top of the League of receiving asylum seekers and other migrants, you will also find the Nordic countries. Not Finland, I'm afraid, because they don't have that tradition, and somehow migrants and so on haven't discovered Finland as a reasonable goal for or place for migration. But if Germany can claim a very high number of refugees last year and this year, if you go to per 1,000 inhabitants, they are beaten by far by Sweden, also I think by Norway and Denmark. So this is the kind of image that the Northern European countries, including Germany, like to spread. And of course, there is a counter image on the other end, and that is that the Southern Europeans would call the Northern Europeans Besserwisser, a word which you haven't learned that in yet, meaning you know better than the others. That is, of course, a critic which the Northern Europeans should be living with. But the best of all would be if we really could accommodate these very big differences. There were some political mistakes done when the euro was created 20 years ago. There was this famous walk along the beach in Bretagne between François Mitterrand and Helmut Kohl, where Mitterrand said, "We are very skeptical against this united Germany." Kohl said, "Well, what can I do to reassure you?" Mitterrand said, "We have to have a common currency." Kohl accepted the common currency, but they forgot some nitty-gritties around it, like common political decisions, common social policy, common tax policy, etc., etc. So this is what the Europeans or the Euro members discovered, let's say 6 or 8 or 10 years after the introduction of the euro, 1st of January 2002. So still hope, of course, that this can somehow be mended and accommodated. Now, the similarities between Germany and Scandinavia are much bigger than you might think, except for one thing. I go back to the map very briefly, and you note that between Germany, northern Germany, and Sweden, and also, in fact, between Copenhagen, the little on the Shetland island there, and Sweden, there is some water. There's the Baltic Sea and there's the Öresund. Unfortunately, I have to compare this little piece of water with the English Channel, because there's a saying which is becoming more and more evident when the British are possibly going to arrange a referendum about membership in the European Union. And that is the fact that the Atlantic, which on the map looks much bigger than the English Channel, is in fact much smaller, because the English, by tradition, feel closer to the United States than to the continental Europe. This has historic reasons. Already Winston Churchill said this in the 20s and 30s, and Tony Blair proved that in 2003 when he joined this crazy war of George W. Bush. That in spite of the strong feelings of France, Germany, and other continental countries. So Sweden did not join that war, and Sweden is now a member of the European Union, but the feeling is a little bit more like the British. If I'm in Stockholm, in my hometown, Stockholm, and say I'm now going back to Berlin, well, say hello to Europe, they say, although Sweden is part of Europe. Legally, as member of the European Union, to some extent legally also as member of the Council of Europe, but as a matter of fact, the attitude in Sweden is still, here are we, and down there is Europe. And this is a little difference between the attitude of Sweden, because Germany, as you have heard today, very much is the motor of Europe. Without a strong German commitment to the European Union, the European Union would have fallen apart long ago. But in some, if we use some criteria here, we will find, I have a very easy concept here, 10 times Sweden is about Germany, from a population point of view, from economy point of view, etc., etc. There are lots of things that are so similar, only that they are 10 times more in Germany. The political landscape are similar, and the welfare state, the famous Swedish welfare state, Scandinavian welfare state, is very similar to the German welfare state, only that they came from two different angles. The Scandinavian one came from traditional Nordic social democracy. The German one came from traditional German Christian democracy. And they met somewhere in the middle. The Germans call it social market economy, the Swedes, Scandinavians call it the welfare state. But it's, from a practical point of view, more or less the same. The ecological consciousness, which came up on the agenda in the 1970s, is also very strong both in Scandinavia and in Germany. The immigration policies, as I said, are similar, and there's also, after the First World War, after all, that's the first time in thousands of years that there's no war on the Western European continent. The peaceful solutions is something very important to Europeans, and to particularly to Germany and Scandinavia, for completely different reasons. We have then, of course, the free education, which is something that many people, free both school, preschool, school and university education, which is, of course, something very attractive and something that we all are rather proud of. The big difference is, of course, the German historical guilt burden, which I mentioned, the Nazi years, and also this interesting and somehow very difficult period, the division of West Germany and East Germany. You should also know that the East Germany, which disappeared on the 3rd of October to 1990, that East Germany had in their, the East Germans had a very special feeling in their heart for the Scandinavian countries. Because they felt somehow that this Scandinavian social democratic model was something very attractive. It was an alternative. It was a kind of socialism with a human face. A socialism where you are allowed to across borders, you are allowed to travel and so on, but there's still some equality thinking, some justice thinking in the system, and so on. So they loved it, and Erich Honecker was driving a Volvo, symbolically. But this feeling I notice on the flights, the airplanes between Berlin and Stockholm. There are very many people from this part of Germany who have this nostalgic feeling there. They always had the dream to go to Sweden, and this goes there. And you have the ships along the Norwegian coast, Hurtigruten, which is extremely popular among Germans. Now, Rolf will speak about Vikings, so I leave that. Won't I? So, but the Baltic Sea, the Bing, I have already mentioned. But you should know one thing: if you see a car in the street here, where's HH, you might be a bit confused, because it should be normally it should be only H, meaning Hamburg. But H is occupied by Hanover. So, but it's not only that. Hamburg takes some pride in being the Hansastadt Hamburg. And the same goes for Bremen. They are the Hansastadt Bremen. And what is the Hansastadt? Well, this was after the Vikings had done their job. We had from the 12th, 13th through the 14th, 15th, 16th, up to the 17th century, we had a very ambitious trade program called the Hansa League, where port cities in Lübeck, Hamburg, Bremen, and down to also Ostende and Brugge in Netherlands and Belgium, up to Visby, Kalmar, Stockholm, and also the Baltic states, Riga, Tallinn, and the Russian St. Petersburg, Helsinki. All these were connected in a very ambitious trade net through shipping, of course. And this symbolism goes on with the Lufthansa, of course, these days. And today's communications have really exploded between the Scandinavian countries and Germany, particularly northern Germany, in the last 15 years. So there are now a lot of low-price flights, etc. You can find at least 10 different communications between Berlin and Stockholm, which I'm benefiting from all the time. But of course, the Berliners have one problem. They are still working on their airport, and nobody knows how long they are going to do that. In the meantime, we have to live with these other two airports who are functioning comparatively well. In the history, there were a lot of royal contacts. No country is so full of princes and princesses and dukes and counts and so on as Germany. So they deliver the most important stuff to the boulevard press in this country, and they also add one or two royalties. They have always added royalties. The Nordic countries imported princes already from the 14th century, and today the Swedish queen is born German with a Brazilian mother. There's one thing more which is important to know. Some of you heard me speaking about that yesterday, and that is about the 30-year war, which was the most terrible war in Europe before the First World War, and which was very much a war between northern Protestants against southern Catholics, the border going somewhere in the middle of Germany. There are still today children who can quote the statement, bet mein Kind, bet, morgen kommt der Schwed. That means, pray, my child, pray, tomorrow comes the Swede. That was something you could really scare your children with. The Napoleon Wars were very crucial for the Nordic countries because things changed. Sweden lost Finland, Denmark lost Norway, and there became a union between Sweden and Norway and so on. So that was very complicated. And then, of course, the Germans had three crucial wars in order to become the second Reich in 1971. First Denmark, then Austria-Bavaria, and then France. And then it was settled by Bismarck for the Second Reich. But most important, of course, before I end this introduction, is the German cultural influence. For me, very dear. I can assure you, I wouldn't be living here in Berlin if it hadn't been for this fantastic culture of Germany. First of all, we have a language which some people say the languages we speak in the Scandinavian countries are a kind of ugly dialects of German. Which is perhaps a little bit rude, but of course we are related linguistically, and there are more or less differences between the various languages. What they also brought, the Germans, at a very early stage in the 9th century, well, it's late from a European perspective, but for the Nordic perspective, there were German bishops who came with Christianity up to Denmark and Sweden, and later on also to Norway and Finland. The administration, the architecture, and the construction and so on, as if I speak for Sweden, southern and central Sweden, I can tell you that all the way from the 12th century on, that was an enormous influence because they were there. They simply did the job to a large extent, not only designed the buildings, they also constructed them to a large extent. Science and technology, enormously important. And here it comes also to a factor that if you were a scientist in social sciences or natural science or whatever science up till the Second World War, and you wanted it to be read outside your own country, Sweden, Denmark, Norway, you would write the summary, you know, this one that you always write, in German, not in English. That was the praxis in the academic world until then. So the connections, scientific, cultural, were enormous. The exchange of schools, of universities, student groups, etc., went very much between Scandinavia and Germany. And then there's a break. I will tell you then about the differences during the Second World War. But if you take Sweden, for instance, the German was the favorite language in school until the end of 1942. Everybody asks themselves, why end of 42? The war went on another 3. Well, yes, but you know, Sweden was neutral. This neutrality was very, shall we call it, pragmatic. And this meant that through the first years of the war, Sweden both exported iron ore to the German war machine and also let troops go through Sweden on sailed trains. So the Swedish neutrality was questioned, right so, by many. Of course, the generation after is happy that it happened because perhaps we wouldn't exist otherwise if the neutrality had not been a little bit abused. But by the end of 42, Rommel had lost in Northern Africa. Paulus was about to lose in Stalingrad. The German enterprise was about to lose. And the politicians in Stockholm, for instance, they realized that. So they sent the best diplomats to London in order to have similar deals with England. And from then on, the English language in the school took over as the most important language. That's an interesting pragmatic story. And today, unfortunately, we're still suffering from that. I can't speak for Denmark, but in the Swedish schools and universities, the German language is very marginal still. English is very big, and German language has a rather weak position because they take it for granted that the Germans speak English, which is not always the fact. These differences was, of course, that Denmark was occupied by the Nazis in 1940. Norway was occupied by the Nazis in 1940. Finland fought first one war against Soviet Union, the winter between 39 and 40, and then another war in 1944, then on the German side, which made the whole Nordic map very complicated, just post-war map. In the middle was Sweden as a neutral country. This also had the effect that still today, there are different solutions of the security issues. Denmark, Norway, Iceland, members of NATO, Sweden neutral, and Finland was until the 25th of December 1991, when Soviet Union fell apart, had this particular dependence on Soviet Union and didn't have free hands to take whatever deal or do whatever deal they wanted to do. The consequences later on is then that Denmark became members of the EU already 73, Sweden and Finland only 95, whereas Norway and Iceland are still not members of the EU. I think Norway we will have to wait another 2 generations, and Iceland depending a little bit on which government is on. Today, we are strong trade partners, of course, with Germany. All the Scandinavian countries, for all of us, it's the biggest partner. And we are politically close, but it's one interesting story which confirms what I said before. The Swedish Prime Minister Reinfeldt invited Mr. Cameron and Mutti. You have to learn who Mutti is. That is Frau Merkel, and the Dutch Prime Minister to a dinner and a little ride in a rowing boat outside Stockholm. That is an old political symbol. And the point was they would try to create a coalition against Juncker as EU Commissioner. Of course, it didn't succeed because Mutti, she let the guys talk and so on, and she, after all, then decided we support Juncker, and he is now going to be the president. But this is, otherwise, they are politically rather close. Culturally, it could be much closer if let's say, Scandinavian countries had been not so Anglophone as they are, and so much oriented towards America and American film industry and culture. The French, already 20 years ago, introduced an expression, l'exception culturelle. And this has to do with the TTIP, which the former speaker was speaking about here. And the TTIP may be very good for the trade and so on, but there is one big risk, and that is for the European culture. And fortunately, the French cultural minister and company, they have got the support of the Germans, and they also have the support now since last year of the European Parliament to make an exception for culture, because European culture, with all its specific diversity and richness and so on, would be steamrolled or swallowed by American culture if it were allowed to happen. Otherwise, the Germans, they just love Scandinavia. Unfortunately, they are not loved back because the Scandinavians rather love the United States. But I have a little hope that perhaps now we will, even the Swedes are starting to love Manuel Neuer, Philipp Lahm, Thomas Müller, Mats Hummels, and so it might be time also for the football players to like to go to the Bundesliga, the best league in the world, rather than going to Premier League or to Serie A. So that's for now. Okay. Thank you.